If you've ever been on social media in the last 20 years, or even just been friends with anyone who's a fan of horror games, you've likely been asked this question before. Would you rather go to Silent Hill or Raccoon City? I've probably read this exact prompt hundreds of times in my life, and you will always get a wide variety of answers. However, as of lately, while I've been doing a deeper dive of the Resident Evil games, it truly hit me how wild of a question this actually is, considering how different Raccoon City and Silent Hill become when you look at both locations in depth. To start things off, I'm someone who has been involved in the horror genre all my life. From watching movies I probably shouldn't have as a kid, to actually making horror my full-time job by playing games online. All of it has made me into a horror superfan. I have even played every single Silent Hill and Resident Evil game at this point, even the really bad ones, and routinely do so. That being said, this video is going to be a fun dive into both the Silent Hill and Resident Evil franchises, and why you should pick Silent Hill every single time. Normally in videos like this, you'd probably see the weighing of options, the pros and cons, and why each answer has valid options. There are no options in Raccoon City. The more you look into how Resident Evil functions as a franchise, the worse it will continue to look for you. So, we'll be taking a closer look at some of the problems we'll encounter. Before that, if you think you're simply built different, feel free to let me know in the comments how you would manage to escape Raccoon City. I know. You'll give me the excuses, but I know everything about Resident Evil. I can handle zombies, or even, nah, I'd win. While Raccoon City may be terrifying, you may be thinking to yourself about how scary Silent Hill might be, or how you might not be able to handle what you find while you are there. If Resident Evil is in the in-your-face horror, Silent Hill is a much more invasive horror, psychologically preying upon the trauma of those who stumble across the city. Naturally, people are going to be more averse to their own problems, since facing something much more personal to you can seem more terrifying than any bioweapon ever could be. While it certainly won't be easy to beat, you'll see as we dive further into how Silent Hill works that your odds will actually fare much higher than you'd expect. Lastly, for the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that you, the viewer, must endure the hero's journey specifically. You deciding to leave before anything happens defeats the purpose of the question. I will be going over both a general idea of what your journey will look like and character-specific scenarios. As well, you won't be allowed to use video game cheeses to bypass things, safe rooms aren't magic, and I guarantee you'll be followed into safe areas if a monster would be capable of doing so. With all that being said, let's first take a look at the death sentence that is Raccoon City. So, Resident Evil is quite actually the most prolific horror game IP in existence, so I won't need to explain much of how it works. If you're somehow one of the few people who doesn't know much about the game, here's a brief explanation. Resident Evil is a zombie horror franchise that tends to feature its heroes dealing with various bioweapons and puzzles. As the series progressed, the scale of danger had also progressed, inevitably leading to the bioterrorist events occurring outside the scope of the original Raccoon City. For the purposes of this video, we will primarily be focusing on the journeys of RE1, 2, 3, 0, and Outbreak. However, I will mention other games in the franchise to help supplement some of the points made later. A quick add-on for most of the games in the franchise, the characters in these games are massively lucky and are almost superhuman with some of their feats. They take injuries that would kill the average person, have plot armor at moments they should be absolutely screwed, and are straight up more resistant to the in-game viruses than the average human being. I'm putting this forward now because some characters will survive things you will never survive because they have to. Most characters also have immense amount of training, meaning if you currently do not possess the knowledge of using firearms at a minimum, your odds are going to be down. Even then, the circumstances worsen since many of those specialized in police and military training actually do succumb to many of the game's various threats. Keeping that in mind, let's explore the lay of the land. Raccoon City is the primary location for the early Resident Evil titles. There are a few different subsections, but the primary areas you'd be dealing with are either the Arklay Mountains or the main area of Raccoon City itself. In terms of games, Resident Evil 1 and 0 would take place around the Arklay Mountains, which is situated northwest of Raccoon City, and 2 and 3 and Outbreak would be in various locations inside the city itself. With the Resident Evil 0 and 1, or the Arklay Mountains, you would be in a self-contained scenario. So, as a regular person, you would have no actual worry about being here, since both games are specific special missions to investigate a series of cannibalistic murders in the area. The mountains are already infested with a variety of enhanced animals, including, at a minimum, crows, dogs, and frogs, all of which can do serious damage to a person, and they manage to actually murder many of the Elite STARS members, some of which, our protagonists, ended up trapped in the RE1 mansion leading to the events of the game. Considering the events of RE1 happened months prior to the events of Raccoon City, and the virus that would lead to immense infection originated here, the mountains have likely become a cesspool for animals, all with a bloodlust to specifically make you their next meal. In terms of the question at hand, you will likely be dealing with the events of Resident Evil 2, 3, and Outbreak overall. These games all happen within Raccoon City and feature a variety of locations showing how the city has been quickly falling into ruin. With these games as well, we can learn what your mission actually becomes when choosing Raccoon City. General evacuations would only be available on September 24th. If you are one of the lucky few with the foresight to leave this point, congratulations! That being said, if they didn't immediately jump the gun at the first minor sign of danger, most people would remain in the city. As of the night of the 24th, the city has been roadblocked with police ordered to kill those attempting to leave. This all means, like many others, you are now officially trapped in Raccoon City. Your goal? Escape within a week, or else the city will be nuked with you in it. Your route to freedom is separated into 3 paths, which are the essential plots of the 3 games. These are Claire, Leon, and Sherry escaping by train, Jill and Carlos escaping by helicopter, and the Outbreak survivors escaping. Naturally, you might be skeptical considering I just told you have exactly 3 options to escape. While you might try thinking of alternative routes, let me just give you a little context from the games. The only regular survivors of the Raccoon City events are the ones I mentioned. Any other major characters had left months prior, quite literally died, or are Ada or Nikolai, who have special plot armor you don't have. So let me break down your options. Jill's path, or Resident Evil 3, will be the first of the 3 we will look at. This is arguably the most difficult of the 3. Throughout her journey in Raccoon City, she turns on the power to ride a crashing train to the clock tower, signals for an Umbrella mercenary chopper to come to the clock tower, only for it to be shot down. And she manages to reach the waste disposal factory, or Nest 2 if you're playing the remakes. At this point, she and Carlos board a stolen chopper and escape. It would be that easy if it weren't for all those bioweapons. Through all of these sections, you would have to deal with zombies, including standard, palehead, and mutated, dogs, crows, drain demos, brain suckers, worms, giant spiders, hunter betas, hunter gammas, and the grave digger. Now, you may have noticed I omitted Nemesis entirely from this roster. Truth be told, one of the only positives you would have is that Nemesis doesn't care about you. Nemesis is a tyrant specifically trained to hunt down STARS operatives, and those who get in the way of that mission. If you're watching this, congratulations on not being enlisted as a STARS operative. You get to avoid one of the most lethal monsters in the whole franchise. Kind of. So, while Nemesis won't be your problem, the funny thing I didn't mention is this whole route is unusable because of Jill Valentine. Yeah, so here's our issue. It'd be too early to actually do any of this before the events of Resident Evil 3, considering UBCS wouldn't be deployed until September 28th. The escape routes wouldn't make any sense, even more so since they'd be needed for train operation choppers and even obtaining the stolen chopper. Let's assume you worked tangentially to Jill in some way. Nemesis is with her the entire time, meaning you'd be murdered for aiding a STARS member. If you tried waiting for Jill to do the work, you would also end up dead. Nemesis quite actually murders the whole train of survivors before dealing with Jill. Not to mention that even if you were in the main cabin with Jill, you would have to survive a full-blown train crash, which you would most likely die from at this point. Miraculously, if you survive this, you now get to die at the hands of Nemesis. There'd be no safe place to wait for Jill anymore, considering the entire clock tower is filled with giant spiders, brain suckers, and regular zombies, and you would effectively be trapped in here. As for one more case, let's say you decide at this point that Jill is a death magnet to everything around her, and you are going to abandon her instead. The only way to avoid dying at this point would be if you have the strength to move a church bell. On a brief search, your average church bell weighs around 400 pounds. Unless you have the ability to move 400 pounds, you die in the church. If somehow you can move the bell, you'd be greeted with the park. It's at this point you have entered the hunting ground of the Hunter Beta, and will be met with a swift death unless you have acquired heavy military-based weaponry and have the knowledge to also use it, since they would be resistant to almost anything else. Did I mention at this point that Jill would have taken every weapon possible from you? Hypothetically, let's say you ran into Jill in the very beginning and decided your best odds were assuming her role entirely and killing her early, so you wouldn't have to deal with Nemesis, but can still take her place. You would sooner win the lottery than kill Jill Valentine. She is a STARS operative, which in canon is an extremely elite RPD task force that only recruits the most ridiculously accomplished individuals imaginable. Jill Valentine specifically was trained in something named Delta Force, which apparently is a real thing with incredibly strict requirements. Most notably, you need to have 4 years minimum of service. Not to mention, Delta Force famously didn't allow women until about the 90s, and even today, it seems female applicants would only be accepted into the G Squadron, which tended to be a lighter version of Delta Force. This is all more impressive when you consider that she would be 23 at the start of RE1 in 1998, would have to have joined the military at a minimum of 16 or 17 to hit that 4-year active duty requirement, and be recruited by STARS in 1996. She was so impressive during her military tenure that she defied both an age and gender ban and trained alongside the in-game Delta Force, making her the only woman in the world to do this. This is all a long way of me saying there isn't a single world you can hope to take Jill's spot, and you should be ashamed for having that thought. Hell, even if you could, it should be mentioned that the whole Delta Force she trained with was also murdered by the bioweapons later at the events of RE3. This brings us to 2 more options. So, the Resident Evil 3 route ended up being lethal. What about the journey Leon and Claire take in Resident Evil 2? This time, I'll start with the training of Leon and Claire. Frankly speaking, both are not the super soldier Jill is. They're effective equals. Leon being the top of the class at the RPD Police Academy, and Claire being trained by her brother, Chris Redfield, who is equal to Jill in training as he is one of the few infamous STARS members. While not in traditional training, she would at least be on par with Leon, if not stronger. So things are a little bit weirder taking into account that we have 4 distinct routes known as the Claire and Leon route and their B-sides. Including the remake, we actually go all the way up to 8 routes total. For simplicity's sake, I'll be removing the B-sides and primarily focusing on Leon and Claire A, while mainly focusing on the remake lore so we can narrow this down to 2. Just so you don't feel slighted, there's no way in actual hell you're passing the mutated gator fight, which happens in every original game scenario and is the main reason why the encounter was straight up changed in the remake. For these scenarios, the bioweapons you'll be encountering are zombies, dogs, lickers, Plant 43 zombies or IVs, Lesser G monsters, Mr. X, and William Birkin. One primary benefit this time is you can be much more of an opportunist, since Nemesis will not immediately kill you like Mr. X or Birkin would. As well, you can assume that Leon or Claire may be able to deal with some of the major enemies for you. In theory, you can attempt the low odds of disposing of the heroes and assuming their place, but your chances would fare much higher with them, assuming the role they play in the story. For Leon's side, he navigates his way through the RPD to encounter and fight William Birkin. This is the first of many guarantees of death. Why? Well, Birkin managed to take out an entire squad of elite Umbrella agents, and you eventually run into Ada, who will insist you go into the sewers to locate Annette Birkin. The moment you drop into the sewers, hopefully you have the stamina to survive outrunning a giant sewer gator. Honestly, I don't see anyone surviving this alone, considering Leon straight up dicks where the kid her bites. Luckily, after this, you all find Annette. Upon finding her, Leon will be shot while attempting to defend Ada, and your journey will end because Ada will absolutely dispose of you for being dead to weight, since Leon will be unable to defend you at this point. Assuming Ada just ran off to give you a chance, and you were with Leon when you woke up, there's a benefit here actually, in that Leon will most likely deal with Birkin for you while Ada is locked up. So you are actually the safest you'll be for some time. The biggest reason for this is because the sewer is oddly one of the safest locations in the whole franchise. Most of the actual enemies primarily live in the tunnels themselves, so provided you waited at the puzzle door, you would likely only need to defend yourself from a few zombies at most. Assuming Leon returns, you'll then be on the way into Nest. This time around, you can't let Leon do all the work, considering that if you decide to wait behind, Ada will absolutely dispose of you, even with her broken leg. You will most likely perish to many of the lethal endgame enemies, bearing in mind that the lab is swarming with zombies, ivies, and lickers. Not to mention, you'll get the pleasure of being a part of both Birkin and Mr. X at their peak lethality, meaning you will die almost immediately. Assuming you somehow survived, unless you have the stamina to outrun a train, you will die in a fiery explosion. Some of you may be asking, why don't I just kill Ada? She's terrible anyway. First off, she's highly trained and would likely win in a standard fight against you. More importantly, she is also the only means to escape the nest, since she hacks the final elevator code. The only other key would be on Sherry, which you would not have any access to. Ada keeps Leon alive because he is useful to her. He doesn't need you, and the overall odds of surviving Leon's route are virtually non-existent. You may have noticed I didn't mention the game's enemies nearly as much this time as others, and that's because in comparison to Resident Evil 3, the game's enemies are much more manageable. While they wouldn't be easy, expected challenges like the lickers are a knowledge check on whether or not you can avoid making noise. The deadliest common enemy would be the Ivies, which you wouldn't have to worry about until the very end of your journey. For Claire's side, your odds are much nicer in a way. She navigates her way through the RPD, similarly encountering William Birkin. But once again, if you're at all involved in this fight, you die immediately. Assuming you're the luckiest person alive, after this time she runs into Sherry and becomes her guardian. Now, this is a weird part for the scenario, but you will have to pass a vibe check. This whole scenario requires, at minimum, for Sherry to make it to the very end. Without her, you quite literally won't have the keycard needed to access the Umbrella Lab. What this means is if you at all look like your average gamer, Discord mod, or anyone remotely sketchy, you would likely be ditched by Claire on the spot, if not killed, since she would protect Sherry at any cost. Meaning, your way out is now blocked entirely, and you will be abandoned in RPD, also known as your death. Shortly after meeting Sherry, Chief Irons threatens the murder of Claire and has Sherry tie her up while also stealing Sherry. It should be mentioned at this part that Chief Irons fires a gun as a warning shot to Claire. The odds of you being shot at specifically are actually much higher than you would think, since this would both warn Claire and remove a potential 2v1 situation. Assuming you lived, Claire would make her way towards the orphanage, managing to avoid Mr. X, and she'll proceed to save both Sherry and witness Mr. X die to Birkin. You will now be deeper into the sewers with Claire, and you would most likely be able to do the same thing as the Leon route. So you'd be able to wait for Claire to do most of the work for you, and you can hide near the puzzle room taking out any zombies that would come this way. Assuming Claire deals with Birkin, you will all be going into an Umbrella facility called Nest. This is likely one of the weirdest points to make, but normally Sherry would be resting in a room while Claire obtains the antidote for the G-Virus inside of Sherry, and in the past you'd be able to wait. This time, Sherry was in a closed-off room. You would actually be helpful here, since you could defend her from the stray zombies that would wander in. On the way to the train, and with the countdown, if you manage to survive the narrow odds on your journey here, you would be a part of powering up the train and be allowed to wait inside of the train cabin with Sherry while Claire deals with Birkin's final form. Assuming you made it this far, you'd be one of the lucky few survivors of Raccoon City. We can argue that Resident Evil 2 is mostly lethal with how much of a force William Birkin is if your name isn't Claire or Leon. Assuming you didn't want to play the low odds of this, or you know already you fit the description of your average Discord mod, this leaves only one option. Your odds are still painfully low, we only have one option left for you. Luckily, this is your best chance. Resident Evil Outbreak is a lesser-known title on the PlayStation 2, but the story centers across a wide range of characters that are the ordinary citizens of Raccoon City, each of which are all playable. The big catch with the other games is that ultimately their journeys were reliant on superhuman badasses who were the few to escape. This time, you'd be much more suited for what you could potentially accomplish. Unfortunately, Resident Evil Outbreak features a couple of other things we haven't discussed. For one, it appears most people don't get the huge Resident Evil inventories and have about half the slots from 8 down to 4 in most cases. This means the previous characters physically had more to work with than you will ever get. The biggest problem in RE2 and 3 is that all of the characters had enhanced resistances. You do not, and Outbreak shows what will actually happen to you. In Resident Evil Outbreak, there is an internal virus counter likely referencing the fact the virus would be airborne at this point. This means not only do you have to deal with the trouble of escaping, but during every single scenario, you will be fighting off the infection. Making the previous encounters even worse when you factor in that you've been slowly edging closer to zombieism. Luckily, all is not lost. Even with these factors, Outbreak is survivable, so you'd be able to escape the city with your life intact. Just enjoy that fact before I tell you that Resident Evil Outbreak is among the hardest journeys of the entire franchise. Outbreak will bring you through 10 possible locations on your journey. The bar in Outbreak, the zoo in Wild Things, the Arklay Mountains in Flashback, subway station in Underbelly, RPD during Desperate Times, the below freezing labs, the hospital in The Hive, the Apple Inn during Hellfire, the Umbrella Research and Development Center from End of the Road, and the university in Decisions. We hit an obvious problem since not every survivor is meant to go to each location, and it's more likely they get separated from the bar and split into different scenarios. We have cases where it's clear Yoko is meant to be in the labs and Cindy is meant to be in the zoo. We can address an exact path in a moment, but we need to address the most important fact here. To start, Outbreak has the weirdest condition. The only way you would end up among the Outbreak survivors is if you were a drinker. Every survivor that is in the Outbreak scenario starts in the bar. You wouldn't know intuitively to be in that specific bar, so by chance you'd have to both hope that you like to drink and that you would choose to go drinking in there that night. Another important fact in Outbreak is we don't have a true accurate canon to the events of the survivors since it was heavily customizable. This means specific liberties may need to be taken here on where you end up and how challenging things may be. That being said, some things to consider on a potential path. 1. You aren't a video game character who fully recovers between events. You also won't lose resources you already had, but any injuries would carry over. 2. You are forced to end up at the university in Decisions. While yes, some survivors are able to escape and end of the road, you must acquire the vaccine, Daylight. This is the only doable case here, and waiting any longer would zombify you. 3. Outbreak scenarios have the meanest enemies in the franchise. Every enemy also carries equal weight on a standard hit, since all progress your infection status in addition to the normal damage they'd inflict. 4. While some medicines act as a zombie suppressant, using too many of these will mean the death of your allies, since they are also mostly average Joes and resources are scarce. Some scenarios will be impossible to do entirely solo, so you can't just hoard all of these. While we don't have an exact path that is painted out for you, there is an assumed fairness since you wouldn't be required to do all 10 scenarios. You would just have to follow George specifically since he will eventually be the one to create the vaccine that will be needed to cure everyone, and you would need the earliest sample. If we look at what mild story beats we hit, George seems to be relevant in below freezing point, the Hive, and decisions. He also would be required to do the intro, and within the story he is quite close to Sydney, who would be required to endure Wild Things. Your theoretical route would become Outbreak, Wild Things, below freezing point, the Hive, and decisions. To narrow this down, let's look at each scenario individually. Outbreak is the game's starting scenario, and would be by far the easiest. The enemies are slower zombies, and the largest hurdle would be to land a required jump while crossing rooftops. It doesn't seem there's any way to bypass this check, so if you are unable to make this jump, you will be left to die in the zombie-infested bar, since at this point, they've all started pouring in. Assuming you can make this jump, it gets much easier. Your main hurdle is just avoiding an oil explosion. You could likely hop down earlier or have another party member do this, so I consider this a safer challenge. Lastly, while the game assumes you will help the police blow up the street, there's actually zero need in doing this, since you are free to leave the moment you see the street full of zombies by heading back to the van. This becomes the easiest scenario by far. We go from one of the easiest scenarios to one of the most challenging by far, since this scenario has so much more to do. While the task of collecting the various medallions and emblems to escape is simple enough, I cannot stress enough the fact there is zero chance in hell you would ever outrun Oscar, the zombie elephant. Elephants have a charging speed of about 25 miles per hour, while the average human being is much slower. Even worse, he bursts into the intro of the zoo and corners you directly. Even without the rest of the zombie animals and other issues, you are immediately cornered by the zombie elephant, and the characters are only alive by the grace of video game logic. Assuming you are the world's luckiest person, you would then need to avoid zombie hyenas, lions, gators, birds, and plants while searching the zoo. The best part of this is the fact that you get a choice between fighting Oscar the elephant or the zombie lion at the end of this, since one of them will be blocking your escape. It's recommended you take on the lion, since elephants are absolute monsters to deal with, and you already have managed one elephant encounter today. Keep in mind, you need to trap the elephant before this, leading to even more time and or expense. Assuming you'd manage to actually survive this scenario, you would then be taken over to... These are the Umbrella Labs, and they are frozen. Luckily, this level should seem familiar, because this is the same lab that Leon and Claire will end up at later in their campaigns. The big difference is there are many more enemies waiting specifically for you to show up this time. Before entering the lab, it should be mostly calm, albeit a little cold. Afterward, however, you get hunters. If you didn't manage to find any high-caliber weapons prior to this, you are almost certainly dead. This is almost a guarantee, since your searching points would have been a bar and a zoo prior to this lab. Assuming you make it all the way to the end of the scenario, you then have the joy of dealing with the G-Adult. Conveniently enough, if you have the train here, assuming you manage to hold out long enough and have the accuracy to actually hit it with the train. A cramped hospital is in our sight, and even worse, you get to deal with the famed Leechman the entire time. The Leechman is one of the most brutal enemies in the franchise, and your only way of dealing with him is by advancing through the hospital and eventually burning him to death by baiting him with fresh blood. If you lose a single party member during this time, you get the joy of Leech Men instead, where you suddenly have more than a single problem. I hope you've been taking care of your friends so far and didn't sacrifice them to Oscar earlier to escape. Afterward, you get to deal with the giant leech who is blocking your boat escape. Luckily enough, this fight is more of a gimmick fight, and if you can utilize the gas valves that are on the way to the fight itself, for once, you get an easy chapter before heading into absolute hell. The fun part here is once you solve the initial early puzzle, you are greeted with 3 different routes that possess all the necessary items for your cure. This single scenario is equal to all of the earlier scenarios combined, and would normally require a forced split up. Unlike the game, you don't have the luxury of respawning fresh every time. Not only are you required to race the clock here, since your infection will be nearing max at this point, but if you didn't save at least 2 of your companions, you are effectively screwed. The 3 routes are all necessary and are much too long for a single person to complete. Your best bet would be to give up your resources to your companions and hope they can brave the tougher locations. In total, you would need the bee poison from the emissions tower, which has become a massive wasp nest, the P base in the water purifying facility, which has become the home of the Hunter Gammas, and the T blood from, well, a tyrant. For these tasks, you would likely have to oversee 2 of them, since the T blood will be available after you acquired either the V poison or the P base. It's highly encouraged for the average person that, unless you have a massive fear of wasps, you go for the V poison. The wasps won't be safe, but you do get a strong gun in this route. It's likely you'd bring one of the other survivors at this point to hopefully take more hits for you, since part of this journey is a long elevator ride involving wasps that are constantly attacking. The alternative path has you deal with the Hunter Gammas, so unless you're a fan of being bored, I recommend you pray and hope your remaining allies can bring back the P-base. The T-blood can only be acquired from the Tyrant here. To get this, you mainly just need to be brave enough to shock a Tyrant with a live wire. It's quite sad that this is one of the easier tasks for you to accomplish. Assuming you were able to make daylight, congratulations, you are almost free from this nightmare. You would have access to enough cures for your group, the world, and plenty more as weapons against your final obstacle, the Tyrant Thanatos. The big gimmick here is how good of a shot are you under pressure. You need to land a shot of the daylight vaccine into the Tyrant from a specialized gun. This is a lot easier said than done, but considering what you've endured at this point, freedom is a single shot away. Upon landing the shot, you've done it! You've gotten one of your only realistic escapes from Raccoon City. Considering all you've endured at this point, you can see just how low your odds really are to escape Raccoon City. We now understand that Raccoon City is, for the most part, a death sentence. However, Silent Hill has cemented itself as the pinnacle of horror, diving much deeper into the personal feelings of you, the player. Between the 2 games, the dangers you face end up changing for a few reasons. For one, in Raccoon City, the survivors of RE3, 2, and Outbreak were quite actually the only survivors of the event, considering the city received a massive firebomb. So this would be the only means of escape for you available. Silent Hill, on the other hand, has the potential to be much more invasive, since the town is a current location you can go to at any point and will tailor itself off of you, the viewer, specifically. I should also mention that enemies as a whole are much less lethal, albeit terrifying, since these tend to be creations of a haunted town and not literal bioweapons bred to kill. Prefacing this, while we can take a look at the different games, they won't be an exact one-to-one experience. What you endure firsthand would be more representative of your own trauma in most cases. Oddly enough, this is a double-edged sword. If you live a life free of trauma, you can be like Laura, and the town is just empty. If you have trauma equal to or greater than the characters in the games, somehow you will land yourself in your own personal hell. The last case to mention is, in some examples like Silent Hill 1 or Homecoming, the monsters are a general blight to the town, and your trauma in relation to the town wouldn't have any impact, since they are supplied through others and not yourself. All this means is you will have to deal with these threats if this were your own hypothetical situation. Before hopping into specific games, let's see which games you'd be able to pretty much ignore since they would require a particular setup to end up in. In Silent Hill 2, you would be called to the town to search for your dead wife, in a journey to learn what happened and face the horrors of the truth. Shockingly enough, if you've never had a spouse, and more importantly have never murdered your spouse, you get to essentially be Laura, wandering an empty town, where nothing happens. In theory, you could be like Angela or Eddie, but again, this requires you to have murdered a human being. I really hope this doesn't apply to any of you watching. In Silent Hill 3, if your name is not Heather Mason, you're good to go. This game specifically requires you to be the child saved at the end of Silent Hill 1, since this is a mandatory condition to have a god be born from within you. The good news is, you aren't Heather Mason. Assuming someone in the comments mentions you could potentially have to deal with this game, here's even better news. 1. If you're a man, you're immediately safe since you cannot give birth, and therefore wouldn't be seeked out. 2. Heather Mason is a 17-year-old mall rat who passes out in hamburger shops. I think you are either equal to or probably better off than this health-wise. She also finds all of her tools along the path. 3. The only real hiccup is that you would need Agilophotis to not give birth in the game's climax. Considering the amount of hoops you're forced into to end up pregnant with God, you would likely already have this, considering you'd have to somehow be tied to Silent Hill 1, and it's not fair to make this unwinnable since we already had to extremely force the journey to happen already. Silent Hill Downpour requires you to be a prisoner trying to avenge your dead son and is entirely specific to Murphy. Assuming you have to go through this, for some reason, Murphy is an average dude pardoned by a prison sentence. He has 0 prep since he breaks free from a bus crash, and your toughest challenge would be surviving the various death slides the town is conjuring for some reason. Even still, Downpour heavily requires you specifically to be Murphy for the scenario to happen, so we are forcing a bad time that you wouldn't be enduring. Ascension is something that you probably don't even want to think about, but consider every individual involved is an entirely average person or a child, so I think you're probably well off here. The short message requires you to be a suicidal teenage girl who can jog at a moderate pace without stopping. Either 1, you aren't a suicidal teenage girl, or 2, you have less athletic ability than the main character. It's very likely you're safe here considering this. Even with our character's state, she is trapped in a loop and given multiple tries to overcome her trauma. You would need to go extremely out of your way to end up in that situation, and you would have the benefit that the premise wants you to succeed even if you have personal doubts. I should also mention that Ascension and the short message both do not take place in Silent Hill itself and are a product of something called the Silent Hill effect, where you end up going through Silent Hill-like locations. For the sake of this video, we'll be counting these including Silent Hill 4, which also does not take place in the town at all. With that, we have the actual games that can affect you, which we'll address from least dangerous to most. Origins is surprisingly one of the easiest ones, even if your initial thought doesn't seem that way. You get brought to the city of Silent Hill as a trucker and get thrown into the initial sacrifice of Cheryl, by you stumbling upon a burning house and saving her. People frequently assume this one might be tough since the common meme with this game is you punch everything in Silent Hill. So the funny part is that in All Ways Possible, you were probably fine, and here's why. Travis is an incredibly out-of-shape trucker who may possibly be asthmatic. You have a guy who quite literally can't run more than 20 seconds without needing to chug an energy drink. He drops hard very quickly despite any melee capabilities he has, especially since he breaks every single weapon you can use. I assume you are much better off than this since Travis is less athletic than every Silent Hill protagonist ever. Travis has enemies that are entirely dependent on his own personal trauma. This makes the above even better since you can likely deal with your own faults better than Travis can. Your only actual enemy is the demon at the end, which is a minor devil. I want to note Travis is fully equipped with weapons at this point of various types, and honestly he can punch the thing to death. You got this, champ. Silent Hill 4 puts you in the titular room, where you are a guy with a terrible apartment. Henry is a shut-in, a gooner, and physically painfully average. From everything we've talked about so far, I give credit enough that this game actually is dangerous if you were to end up in it. However, Henry is able to do it and, well, look at him. For major obstacles, the worst of all is easily Walter himself, the need to take care of Eileen. Luckily, there are plenty of resources throughout the game that makes this manageable, since the room has healing properties, and candles can help the whole Eileen issue. The biggest issue of Walter, funny enough, is that he straight up just has a gun. Although you would have your own, and there's a good shot if you shoot first, you're probably fine. You would also have the other game's bosses, which are rather minimal considering you have the one truth, which more just has you pass a knowledge check on which one is the real enemy that can be killed with basic melee hits or really anything, and Andrew Del Salvo, one of the ghost victims, which, provided you didn't waste the obvious silver bullet earlier, good news, he's very easy to handle. A lot of the alleviation is that you and Eileen would be intended as the final sacrifices here of the 21 Sacraments, so you are given some leeway in the threat of Walter until the second half of the game. This is the one you likely expected to hear about when you clicked on the video, and as you'd expect, it's one of the only ones that pose a challenge. In the original game, the focus of personal trauma is much less of a factor since your goal here is to save your daughter, Cheryl, after she is lost from a car crash. While everything you would need is given to you throughout the game, this is easily one of the most terrifying experiences, especially if you have a fear of giant bugs. The hardest part of all of this is actually the fact of just how absurdly difficult the original game was. Some of the puzzles blocked out players from ever beating the game when it came out, and to actually get the ideal ending, you'd need the knowledge of Dr. Kaufman's Agilophotis for later. For physical requirements, Harry is able to walk through all the town, although it is always a bit of a meme about how much the man can run and fight without ever tiring out. The game likely expects a slower pace for the guy since he is just a rider with no special physical feats. First boss, Splithead, is easy enough since there is a note you would find directly before telling you to shoot in the mouth, the shotgun you already found here, which also is probably the most obvious spot to shoot. Twin Feeler is definitely another easy boss that gives you a weapon during the fight. His primary attack is slowly ramming you in the occasional acid spit. It won't be the easiest thing, but this is still rather easy since you just don't get rammed. Clothes Singer is probably the toughest boss you'd have to deal with in this game, and all the previous ones so by far. It's a giant mop, and you better be decent with a gun here. Taking game mechanics out for a second, I don't care how many health drinks or medkits you have, that's a massive stinger, and you're gonna die if you get impaled. The poison also won't be good, and it is manageable. This is definitely more dangerous than the game would showcase, making this the toughest of fights so far. Sybil is tough if you are a terrible person. This, once again, is more of a knowledge check, considering if you searched the hospital, you would have found the Agilophotis. Using this, you can then cure Sybil, saving her life and avoiding literal bullets. If you don't save her, she is arguably tougher than the Walter fight from Sonic 4, since she won't budge until she's dead. Incubus will be the final of the bosses here, since the incubator version means you die due to bad endings. Bad news is you have to fight a literal devil that you can't fistfight like a sadder devil earlier. The good news, the devil is a failed devil, since if you just dodge the various attacks, it'll just die. This isn't a glitch and is a fully intended design choice on this boss. You have the option to fight it, sure, but it's admittedly pretty simple to just not get hit for a while. Welcome to Hell. This is the only real Silent Hill adventure you would have to worry about. Plot-wise, monsters and cultists have evaded both Shepherd's Glen and Silent Hill as you need to get to the bottom of things. Personal trauma has slight play here. The monsters stem from a failed sacrifice, since the main character led to missing one of the 4 necessary sacrifices. You can assume the sacrifices still hadn't fully happened leading to this, albeit the final encounter hypothetically could be weaker or stronger if you include your own trauma. Every Silent Hill character up until this point has been a relatively average person, barring maybe Murphy, who would still be average except for his prison developments. Alex Shepard is the first character who actually has some form of military combat training, since he is a soldier coming home. The upside for you is the training is still rather minor, considering the big plot twist here is that Alex never was in the military, and instead was trained minorly by his military father before being sent to a mental asylum. It's still more than the rest, however, you have some fair odds since you don't need to be Delta Force Jill, at the least. Homecoming does have some dangerous enemies as a whole, especially the Order soldiers, who not only are actual combat-trained enemies, but some have rifles, which honestly might just be the most lethal thing we've seen here so far. Boss-wise, honestly, I'm not even sure how Alex manages some of these, and this is your likely point of death if you aren't taken out by Order soldiers. The Fulker is already a massive boss, and not using video game logic, you would likely be immediately flattened with the giant fist. Sure, there are intended mechanics with the bookcases and flesh bags you can use, but this would still be difficult. Scarlet is arguably the fastest enemy in the game, and starts the fight by immediately ripping off the head of her father. She can try this exact same attack to you, and it's very likely she would succeed. Assuming she doesn't do that, I would argue you would need enough strength to shatter her porcelain shell with the crowbar or axe you would have. You could in theory win this fight, although you would likely be severely injured. Asphyxia isn't a problem since she's incredibly telegraphed. Provided you can dodge rammings, kind of like earlier with Twin Feeler, you should fare rather well here actually, since you would also be well stocked if you made it this far. It's at this point, good news, you are dead and can go no further. As you infiltrate the Order, you end up getting knocked out by Curtis and kidnapped by the game's primary villain. The fun here is you have a notable cutscene where Alex's leg is drilled. In a video game, he can break out of this and fight back. In real life, you will never survive this, even if you manage to actually break free. Your leg has been drilled, you cannot walk, and the Order is coming. You're just done here, and you'll bleed out. If you wanted to assume that didn't happen, you would have to continue fighting soldiers with only a knife, and also be required to fight and kill Curtis, who is wielding a chainsaw. A fight you are incredibly unlikely to win without being named Leon S. Kennedy. If you manage to reach the end, a minion is much easier than anything else you tackled at this point. Nothing that will be immediately shattering for hits, but at the least you will be able to actually fight this off without breaking reality as a whole. Plus, with the game's final boss, you're well equipped at this point. While you bleed out as you exit the sewers and head home, at least you can take some solace in knowing this is the only unbeatable Silent Hill journey. All of the above is probably not what you fully expected, so let's dive into one more hypothetical journey that will catch the last bit of it. What if you, the viewer, were specifically called the Silent Hill, and had to endure your own personal struggles? It's important to note that our own personal fear and trauma can hit even harder than the most terrifying bioweapon. I wanted to highlight all of the Silent Hill titles before talking about this one, because while it's not easy to confront ourselves, you can do it. Silent Hill is a franchise where everyone is involved is just a person dealing with their problems. They don't need to be specially trained. They don't need to avoid a nuke or do some Herculean task to escape to doomed city. Silent Hill calls denizens to deal with themselves, and you either sink or swim. I can't tell you what you may find if you ended up here, because that's entirely what you've endured in your life up until this point. It could be a potentially empty town, or it could be a chilling image of your greatest fears confronting you as a manifested monster. The catch here is you can tackle it in one way or another using the resources the town will provide for you to handle it. I should note the only impossible journey in this whole franchise is the direct result of physical torture from another human being, or human beings using guns. Your odds are much better here by far, even if it does seem impossible at times. Between Raccoon City and Silent Hill, most of the Silent Hill adventures are beaten by absolutely average Joes, or even below average people, where most of the fear comes from personal demons instead of weapons designed to slaughter humanity. Anyone dealing with Raccoon City is either 99% dead, or an elite military badass who still barely manages to hold on at times. Let this video be the answer to the age-old question. Pick Silent Hill every time. Not only would you be better off, but you would likely also gain personal growth with anything you had to face. Now, if you are Jill Valentine herself watching this video, go ahead and argue. Otherwise, it's pretty clear you should stay as far away as possible from Raccoon City.